Welcome to my coronavirus classroom. I'm Janessa Jacobs, and this is the immune system. So the first way that we can think about the immune system is kind of what we're born with and protects everybody the same way against a wide variety of substances, or our innate defenses, and then our adaptive defenses, which you're not born with. You have to actually encounter a pathogen to develop adaptive defenses, and that's kind of the first two ways that we break down the immune system. Another way that we can think about it as far as like lines of defense. We've got a first and second line of defense that are part of our innate defense, and our third line of defense is when we kick in our adaptive immunity or our specific lymphocytes. So we'll get there as we move throughout lecture today. So our first line of defense is part of this innate defense. Innate defense is something that we're born with. So we're born with, and it protects against a wide variety of substances in the same way, or a wide variety of pathogens or potentially harmful substances in the same way. So protects against wide range of substances. We could say pathogens, antigens, etc., allergens, splinters. So protects against a wide variety or a wide range of substances the same way. So it doesn't get really better with time. So the first way that we can do something is to prevent the entrance of materials into our body. And your skin doesn't get better with time at that. You're born with skin, and your skin's always going to hopefully prevent the entrance of materials into your body. So that's kind of an example of that. So you're born with your innate defenses, and they are going to protect against a wide variety of substances in the same way. Adaptive defenses you are not born with. Adaptive defenses you acquire as you encounter pathogens out there in the environment. And so you develop this immunity and you get cells that are specific to it. What's really cool about adaptive defenses is that it is specific and it has memory. So we'll talk a lot more about that. Adaptive, this is, we'll say this is our specific immune response. And we'll say it's acquired with pathogen or antigen encounter. Acquired with antigen encounter. All right. So, this innate defense has two lines of defense, or two branches, and this adaptive defense has one. So let's first look at our first line of defense. And what our first line of defense is protecting against is the entry of pathogens or foreign materials into your body. So if we look at the structures of the first line of defense, that's your skin and your mucous membranes, and these are both going to help prevent the entrance of pathogens or foreign materials into your body. So they prevent the entrance of foreign materials into your body. And so your skin and intact epidermis and dermis are going to be able to prevent the entrance of pathogens. If, say, you hurt your finger, then that is not going to prevent the entrance of pathogens. That's an area where pathogens can get right in. So for our skin, and this is actually true of both of these things, for these to prevent the entrance of pathogens, they have to be intact. So our intact skin and mucous membranes are going to prevent the entrance of pathogens into our body. And how are they going to do this? Well, our skin provides a physical barrier. It also has a chemical barrier. I mean, the physical barrier is not hard to understand. It's an actual physical membrane that separates you from the external environment. Chemical barrier, what do I mean by that? Well, if you remember, skin, the epidermis of your skin, is keratinized, stratified squamous epithelial tissue. That keratin gives you some waterproofing, so that can actually help prevent the entrance of some things into your body. So keratin is kind of one part of the chemical barrier. But then we also have your sweat, which is rich in like urea, uric acid, waste products. So it actually creates what's called the acid mantle of the skin, which is the slightly acidic pH of the skin due to sweat. And so that's going to be another kind of chemical barrier. And then there's also biological barriers from the cells that are present. So your skin is pretty darn good at preventing the entrance of stuff. For our chemical barriers, we'll say we've got the acid mantle of the skin, which is the low pH of the skin due to sweat. This is antimicrobial. Another part of the chemical barrier, keratin. And this resists, we could say, the absorption of toxins and things. Or I'm just going to say the absorption of materials. What else in the sweat? I believe that there's an antibody, IgG, or something that we can find in sweat. So that's part of the chemical barrier. For our biological barrier, these would be cells that live in the skin that are able to do something. So does anybody remember from last semester what the only resident cells that do any kind of immunity for the epidermis are? They're the dendritic cells that are phagocytes. So that's one part of the biological barrier. But then if you look down in the dermis where we do actually have blood supply, you can have macrophages that run in and out. And then there are also resident mast cells that are kind of important. Those are going to be more part of our second line of the defense. Our second line of defense, the cells that we get to. But as far as skin goes, it also forms a biological barrier because it's got these living parts that are going to help prevent the entrance of foreign materials into your body. So, biological barrier, we could say the skin contains phagocytes and mast cells that are going to help act as a biological barrier. Okay, mucous membranes, intact mucous membranes, what do they have? Well, mucus, depending on where you look, is going to determine what the mucous membrane is doing. So if you look at the mucosa of your respiratory tract, that mucus is going to entrap debris, and let's say in your nasal cavity, the ciliated cells there are going to beat that mucus back, and then you'll swallow it down your pharynx, and it'll go through your esophagus to your stomach where there's hydrochloric acid. So that's going to be one thing to be aware of as far as the mucous membranes go in your respiratory tract. When you get lower down in your respiratory tract, you also have ciliated cells that beat the mucus up in what's called the mucus escalator. So that beats the mucus up to the pharynx for the same reason. If you get the mucus to the pharynx, you can swallow it, and then you can deal with it in the hydrochloric acid in your stomach. What else about mucous membranes? Like you've got in the mucous membrane of your oral cavity, you have saliva, which has antibodies in it that can help. Also contains this enzyme called lysozyme. Lysozyme we find in many body secretions. So lacrimal fluid has lysozyme, some saliva has lysozyme. I think sweat has some lysozyme in it too. And what lysozyme is an enzyme that's antimicrobial. If you think about zyme, that's an enzyme. Lyso, what does it do? It causes cell lysis. So that's going to be another important thing that we get from mucous membranes. So we can think about different parts of mucous membranes, ciliated cells in the respiratory tract, propel mucus to the esophagus, propel mucus to the pharynx so you can swallow it. at the mucosa of the stomach, it's secreting hydrochloric acid, so that's definitely antimicrobial. So that would be another thing. The mucosa in the GI tract, we could say our GI tract mucosa contains digestive enzymes. This is also antimicrobial. So this swallowing it is why this matters. The hydrochloric acid in your stomach is going to digest most microbes. You could also say that like your oral mucosa, saliva contains lysozyme. Lysozymes in a lot of stuff. So basically by trapping debris in mucus, we can give some innate protection and hopefully prevent the entrance of a variety of substances through those mucous membranes into our body. So just imagine which mucous membrane or which organ you're thinking about, and you can imagine what the mucous membrane does. In the respiratory system, it traps debris and propels that mucus to the pharynx. In the digestive system, the mucous membrane is secreting the digestive enzymes that are helping give this barrier. So those are the structures of our first line of defense. So the structures of the second line of defense are cells, our phagocytes, and natural killer cells. But then our second line of defense has these generalized body responses. The inflammatory response, which has some inflammatory chemicals that are going to be involved. We'll also talk about some other protective chemicals that are antimicrobial proteins. Fever is another whole body response that can happen in response to illness in the body. So let's start by talking about our cells. The phagocytes are our neutrophils and our macrophages. Neutrophils are phagocytic for bacteria. When a neutrophil eats a bacteria, it eats a bacteria, does phagocytosis, processes it, and dies. So neutrophils are actually kind of better when they do this thing called respiratory burst. If you recall when we talked about blood, we went over this process, and in respiratory burst, a neutrophil will take all of its lysosomes and put them up to its cell surface and let them degranulate, or release all of the digestive enzymes. When that happens, it kills the neutrophil, but it also creates an antibacterial kill zone that kills the bacteria in the area. So neutrophils are phagocytic for bacteria, but they also do respiratory burst. I'm not going to write that down again because that was just a review, and we've already talked about it, so you should know it still. Macrophages are phagocytic for anything foreign. So they'll try and gobble up a splinter, a bacteria, a virus, whatever. So these are phagocytic for anything foreign. All right. So those are our phagocytes. Natural killer cells are our next type of cell, and natural killer cells are really our anti-cancer cells. So when a cell is undergoing unregulated DNA replication, that can be indicative that a cancerous process is going on, and natural killer cells will induce apoptosis in those cells. They can also induce apoptosis in any virus-infected cell. They do so by injecting these things called perforins and granzymes. So let's just imagine for a minute, this is our sick cell, and our natural killer cell, or this is our cancerous cell, and our natural killer cell comes along and recognizes this. So what it's going to do is it's going to release these chemicals called perforins. So it releases perforins. And these are proteins that are going to punch a hole or perforate a hole in the plasma membrane. So these create a hole in the membrane. And then the natural killer cell is going to inject a lethal dose of these things called granzymes. So we'll release perforins and granzymes. And our granzymes are enzymes that induce apoptosis. What is apoptosis? Shriveling up and dying. So now this cell, this cancerous cell, will shrivel up system. So natural killer cells can also do this in virus-infected cells, but they'll do that for any virus-infected cell. We'll see our T lymphocytes, our specific lymphocytes, are only going to fight specific virus-infected cells. Talk about that in a little bit. All right. So the next part of our second line of defense is the inflammatory response. And the inflammatory response is a generalized response to any tissue damage or injury. So it's a generalized response to any tissue damage or injury. So there are kind of actually lots of benefits to an inflammatory response. As it swells, it's going to hurt and you're going to protect it. So it causes pain and you protect it, or so you protect the area of injury. Another benefit is that it allows for white blood cells to get to the area. So it allows for white blood cells to get to the area, and they can then fight any potential introduced antigen or pathogen. They can also help to heal. So it sets the stage for healing. And it's going to wash the wound. So if we introduce anything that we need to get to a lymph node and say start an immune response, we can wash that into the lymph that is draining there. And so we can say the inflammatory response washes the wound, and so we'll say it's going to set the stage for an immune response if needed. So you recall when we talked about lymph, we said that it forms as the extracellular fluid from capillary exchange drains into lymphatic capillaries. Well, in an inflammatory response, as we'll see, we're going to bring a lot more blood to the area. So if we get a lot more blood to the area, there's a lot more plasma to the area, and we push that all out. So now the 15% that gets stuck there is a lot bigger than the 15% in a normal capillary bed. This extra fluid is called exudate, and it washes the wound so that if there was any bacteria or debris or anything like that, we pull it into the lymphatic capillaries, and then we can run it past the lymph node, where we have macrophages that can deal with the debris, and we've got lymphocytes that can mount a specific immune response. So this is actually pretty important. Okay. So what are the cardinal signs of the inflammatory response? And then we'll talk about what causes each, that related to the benefits, and then we'll talk about all of the stages of the inflammatory response. So we've all experienced inflammation. What do we see? We see redness. And this is due to increased blood flow to the area. We see heat. This is also due to an increase in blood flow. Blood is hot, but also these damaged cells in the area are going to start doing a lot of stuff. They're going to become metabolically active, which is going to increase the heat in the area as well. We also see swelling. Now this is going to be due to the increase in blood flow, but it's also due to the increase in exudate. And this exudate, I'm going to put in parentheses here, is the extracellular fluid rinsing the capillary bed. No, I'll say rinsing the area. And then we get pain. And this pain is due to the swelling. As you swell in the area, you're going to start pushing on nociceptors, and it's going to hurt. This is going to cause you to protect it. So the pain is due to swelling, pushing on our nociceptors. And so now we're protective. been looking for this pointer. Okay, so what are the stages of the inflammatory response? We one stage leads to the next. So the first thing that we'll talk about is inflammatory chemical release. And if you recall, we said connective tissues have resident cells called mast cells that release pro-inflammatory chemicals. So that's going to help to set up the stage for our next kind of steps. So the stages of the inflammatory response, the first stage is inflammatory chemical release. And what happens here is that our resident mast cells are going to release chemicals like histamine, which is a vasodilator. So all of the blood vessels in the area are going to vasodilate. We'll get more blood to the area. And then heparin is going to prevent any coagulation in the area. So our resident mast cells release histamine and heparin. Histamine is a vasodilator, and heparin is an anticoagulant. And so this is going to allow for an increase of blood flow to the area. The other thing that will happen is cells in the damaged tissue will release what are called chemotactic factors. So our cells in the damaged tissue release chemotactic factors. So what are these? Chemotaxis is what they're going to stimulate. This is chemical movement. Taxis move you around. Chemotaxis moves cells around. So our white blood cells are going to follow this chemical trail right to the site of damage. So let's just actually draw up a blood vessel and imagine what's going on here. So let's say this is the site of an inflammatory response. And you know that normally we've got our endothelial cells that are just lined up right next to each other. But now we've had some damage. So what's going to happen? Well, histamine is going to vasodilate all of the things in the area. So now we get more blood flow here. The other thing that's going to happen is the size of our intercellular clefts is going to increase. So our capillaries are going to become super leaky. We're going to increase their permeability. And then the cells here are also going to be releasing these chemotactic factors. So all these chemotactic factors are going to go up high in the interstitial space. And as blood is flowing past here, our white blood cells are going to be able to follow that chemical trail right to the site of tissue damage. So another thing that we could say is that our capillaries become super leaky, or our capillaries become leaky as intercellular clefts increase in size. And so now we've got bigger blood vessels because they're dilated, and we've got these bigger intercellular clefts, so we become super leaky. And now our cells in the area are going to release chemotactic factors, which are going to stimulate this process called chemotaxis. So cells release chemotactic factors, that attract white blood cells to the area. So, chemotactic factors, what are these? Chemotaxis is the process of following a chemical trail or moving to an area based on a chemical trail. So taxis move you around, chemicals move white blood cells to the area of damage. So blood is rushing really fast through your body, and so what's going to slow these cells down and let them know where to go? Well, the chemotactic factor is going to draw them there. Another vascular change that happens is the endothelial cells are going to start expressing these things called or CAMs. So these cell adhesion molecules stick off of the endothelial cells, and what happens then is as our white blood cells are going by, they're going to stick to these cell adhesion molecules and roll along the blood vessel, and then be able to follow this chemotactic trail out. So right now, this is like the last part of our chemical step, our inflammatory chemical release, is that the damaged cells are going to release chemotactic factors that will attract white blood cells to the area. Okay. The second stage then, after inflammatory chemical release, is vascular changes. I kind of already talked about them, but let's sum it up as its kind of own step. So vascular changes. We'll say the endothelium expresses CAMs, which are cell adhesion molecules. So cell adhesion molecules, and these will slow white blood cells down. The other vascular change that's going to occur is that we will have vasodilation. So we'll have more blood flow to the area. This increased blood flow is going to increase blood plasma. As you recall, we'll push out all of that plasma on the arterial side of the capillary bed, but only pick up 85% of it on the venous side. That remaining extra 15% now is going to become that exudate that washes the fluid, or the exudate that washes the wound. What else are we going to see? We're going to see an increase in intercellular cleft size. And this is going to increase the permeability of the capillary. So the chemicals cause these changes, and now these changes are going to help set the stage for the next step, which is leukocyte mobilization. So step 3, leukocyte mobilization. Our white blood cells are going to follow this chemical trail out to the site of damage and do their thing. So our third step, leukocyte mobilization. And this kind of has two parts. Margination is when we slow down and roll along these CAMs. Margination. White blood cells roll along our capillary wall or our vessel wall, sticking to our CAMs. And when they start getting to this area where our chemotactic factors are really high, they're going to know it's time to get out. So they're going to follow that chemotactic trail out to the site of damage, and they're going to squeeze through these big intercellular clefts, and that squeezing through is a process called diapedesis. Dia means through, pedesis is referring to like walking, so the cells like walk through, it squeezes through our intercellular clefts so that it can get out there to the tissue. So our white blood cells squeeze through the intercellular clefts, the increased intercellular clefts, and follow the chemical trail or follow our chemotactic factors to the site of damage, or to the site of the injury. Okay, so those are the stages of the inflammatory response. And what we can say now, just to kind of bring it all together with things that we've already learned, is that this increase in extracellular fluid is going to produce this fluid that we're going to call exudate. And exudate is going to wash that wound so that we can drain into lymphatic capillaries, that will drain into lymphatic vessels, that will run past lymph nodes so that we can start an immune response there if something was introduced to the body. So the last kind of thing to be aware of is that the increase in extracellular fluid formed due to the increase in blood flow is exudate that washes the wound our lymphatic capillaries, pick up exudate, and run it past lymph nodes to start an immune response if needed. That's the inflammatory response. Alright, so which is not one of the cardinal signs of an inflammatory response? A, swelling. B, redness. C, fever. D, pain. I feel like start doing a dance or something during this time. I'm trying to figure out like a good thought.
Works for me. I got so many times.
The answer is fever is not one of the cardinal signs of an inflammatory response. It's another generalized body response that we'll talk about in just a moment. Okay, so antimicrobial proteins are another part of your second line of defense. And there are a couple types. We're going to talk first about these things called interferons. And if you remember, at the beginning of the semester, when we talked about chemical signaling, we were talking about endocrine signaling and paracrine and autocrine and all of that. Well, this is where autocrine and paracrine come into play. So, interferons are chemical signals that are released by virus-infected cells and bind to receptors on neighboring cells and cause them to upregulate their antiviral protein production. So, interferons. This is a message sent by a virus-infected cell to bind receptors on neighboring cells and cause them to upregulate their antiviral properties. So, interferons. Message is sent by virus-infected cells to bind receptors on neighboring cells and cause them to upregulate their antiviral properties. So if the effect is at a neighboring cell, what kind of signaling is an interferon? Endocrine? Paracrine? Neurocrine? Autocrine? It's paracrine. Para means near, crine means chemical signal. This is a chemical signal that's affecting cells nearby. So, what happens? Let's say here's our virus-infected cell. What viruses do is they actually hijack your own DNA. So the virus comes in here and binds to your DNA to get your DNA to replicate the virus. And what happens then is this turns on your own interferon gene. So interferons are then produced and released from the virus-infected cell. It'll bind to interferon receptors in the neighboring cell, and now the neighboring cell can produce proteins that block viral replication in themselves. It's pretty cool. Okay, so a second type of antimicrobial protein is actually, there are a ton, but it's part of what's called the complement system. So there's something like 30 or more complement proteins proteins that are activated in response to different kinds of pathogens in the body, and they do different things. You can go over the details of the complement cascade in an immunology class someday. For now, we're just going to talk about 3. So opsonization, which is flagging something for removal by a phagocyte, enhancing inflammation, and causing cell lysis. So the complement system, we can say that these complement proteins, it's a group of about 30 proteins that help mark pathogens for removal. So the first thing that complement proteins can do, some of them can line up in a cell membrane and form what's called a membrane attack complex, or a MAC. So the complement proteins will line up and basically form this pore, and so whatever's inside the cell can get out, whatever's outside the cell can get in, and so that causes the cell to lyse. So we could say one of the things that the complement system does is cause cell lysis by forming these membrane attack complexes. So complement proteins cause cell lysis by forming MACs, which is a membrane attack complex. So that'll form a pore in the cell, whatever's inside the cell gets out, whatever's outside the cell gets in, and the cell lyses. Another thing that they can do is they can just enhance, complement proteins can enhance inflammation, can be part of these chemotactic factors that assist in the inflammatory response. And then the other thing that they do is stimulate what's called opsonization. Opsonization. So what happens in opsonization then is our complement proteins are going to act like a flag. So let's just say, I don't know, this is a bacteria or something. I can stick a protein, a complement protein on it, and now a phagocyte can see this and more readily ingest it. So opsonization is marking for removal by a phagocyte. All right. So our complement system, again, can induce cell lysis, enhance inflammation, or stimulate opsonization. Fever. What is fever? Fever is an abnormally high body temperature that your hypothalamus allows to occur. So if you recall, body temperature regulation was one of the first examples of negative feedback that we used. And we said that the thermoregulatory center in your hypothalamus is paying attention to your body temperature. It's doing that by sensing how hot blood is. And normally, when blood goes above 98.6, the hypothalamus will kick in efferent messages that stimulate effectors to bring your body temperature down. When you're sick, the hypothalamus doesn't do this. So how does the hypothalamus know you're sick? Well, your infected cells release these things called pyrogens. And as pyrogen level goes up in your blood, the hypothalamus can tell you're sick, so it will temporarily override and allow your body temperature to go up. So, what is fever? It's an abnormally high body temperature that the hypothalamus is just going to let happen. So I'll say not corrected by the hypothalamus. And what are the benefits of fever? Well, when you have an increase in temperature, you have an increase in enzyme activity, an increase in metabolism. So your cells can do more of what they do and just kind of hopefully get your immune system going and an immune response going so that we can wipe the pathogen out of your system. So that's one thing, is we can increase metabolism. The other thing is that it will cause your liver to sequester iron. What does that mean? Sequester means to uptake and hold on to it. Microbes need iron for normal functioning, so by sequestering iron, you can help kind of prevent microbe growth and formation in the body. And then also, because we're increasing our metabolism and we're sick, fever is also going to make you tired and cause you to rest. So while you're resting, your body can be doing everything that it needs to do to fight the pathogen. So the benefits of fever are an increase in metabolic rate, for clearing the pathogen, and this is also going to make you tired and you rest. Kind of a more physiological thing is that it's going to cause the liver to sequester iron. And that's fever. So if your first and second lines of defense fail, then you're going to engage your adaptive response, or your third line of defense, which is specific immunity. The characteristics of the adaptive defenses are that they are specific, meaning that when you start an adaptive immune response, it's going to be to a specific pathogen, and then you're going to have memory for that specific pathogen. So characteristics of adaptive defenses. It has specificity, which means you will produce lymphocytes specific to a specific pathogen. And it has memory. So as part of this production of lymphocytes, you're going to make two kinds of lymphocytes. Effector cells that carry out the response that's going to rid the pathogen from your body at the moment, and then memory cells that will hang out in your secondary lymphatic structures and await future encounter with that same pathogen. So, memory. The adaptive branch has memory because you produce specific memory cells to that, and that's what gives you immunity, or the ability to encounter a pathogen and not get sick. So another characteristic of the adaptive defense is that it has memory. We could say you form memory cells that reside in secondary structures and await encounter with the same pathogen in the future. This is what gives you actual immunity, or the ability to encounter a pathogen and not get sick. Okay, so what are the branches of our adaptive defenses? There are two: the cell-mediated immune system, or the cell-mediated immune response, and the humoral immune response. So the T cell response is one branch, and the B cell response is the other. So our branches are cell-mediated immunity, which is the T cell response, or our T lymphocytes, and our humoral immunity. Remember, our body's fluids are our body's humors, and so this immunity is in your blood. It's all of the antibodies that are circulating around in your blood. So the other branch is our humoral immune system, and this is the part that takes advantage of our B lymphocytes. Okay, so lymphocytes. What the heck are lymphocytes? They're the cells of our adaptive immune response. And they are going to be very specific. So we're going to talk about three kinds of lymphocytes. Helper T cells, T sub H, these are helper T cells. And helper T cells are required for both branches of the immune system to be activated. Helper T cells are required in a cell-mediated response, and they're required in a B cell response, or a humoral response. So our helper T cells are required in both cell-mediated and humoral immunity. Okay, so our first type of lymphocyte, a T helper cell, is required in both cell-mediated and humoral responses. We're actually going to talk about the cell-mediated response first because of this. So since we're already talking about activating a helper T cell, we'll finish it out and talk about activating a cytotoxic T cell. Then we'll wrap back around and talk about the B cells, even though it's presented differently in your book. Okay, so the second type of T lymphocyte we have is a T sub C. This is a cytotoxic T cell. So if we look at this word, cytotoxic, cell, toxic. Our cytotoxic T cells are going to kill virus-infected cells. So when we activate cytotoxic T cells, they're going to start inducing death in our own body. So we really need to make sure that we're fighting an intracellular pathogen. So cytotoxic T cells are going to, we'll say, kill virus-infected cells. Well, they are going to... So cytotoxic T cells are going to destroy... So cytotoxic T cells are going to fight intracellular pathogens and destroy your cells when they're infected. So these fight intracellular pathogens by inducing apoptosis like our natural killer cells did. So these fight intracellular pathogens, and we'll say they induce apoptosis in infected cells. And then the other type of lymphocyte we have is the B cell. And these are going to become cells that produce antibodies and are involved in humoral immunity. Okay. The other cells that are going to be important in our adaptive defense are antigen-presenting cells. So in order for our lymphocytes to be activated, they have to be presented antigen. And if you recall from our discussion of blood and self-antigens, antigens are things that elicit an immune response. So we really need to be able to present antigen to the cells of our adaptive immune response if we want to get things going. So the cells that can do this are macrophages, and then B cells actually become antigen-presenting cells. Dendritic cells can also be antigen-presenting cells. So our antigen-presenting cells, macrophages, are our biggest and kind of best, I think, I don't know, I like them most as far as antigen-presenting cells go. Dendritic cells are resident phagocytes in some tissues. So dendritic cells can also be thought of as antigen-presenting cells. The other ones that we're going to focus on are B cells. So B cells actually become antigen-presenting cells. They're going to then present that antigen to T helper cells to become activated to do what they do. So our lymphocytes are T helper cells, cytotoxic T cells, and B cells. Our antigen-presenting cells are going to present antigen to our lymphocytes, and they're going to be our macrophages and our B cells. All right, dendritic cells are resident cells in some tissues. In the thymus, the dendritic cells are going to help with antigen presentation and T cell training. So dendritic cells, resident cells in our thymus that help with T cell training. You have dendritic cells in other areas, but these are the ones that we'll worry about. The other antigen-presenting cells that we're going to talk about are macrophages, and these are just macrophages we find circulating throughout the blood and in our secondary lymphatic organs. So these circulate in blood and lymphatic, or in lymph. They migrate in and out of tissues. macrophages are pretty cool. And then B cells become their own antigen-presenting cells to present to T helper cells. So they become antigen-presenting cells to present to T helper cells. So next we need to talk about the life cycle of a lymphocyte. This is what gives us adaptive immunity, and what gives us memory is the ability to mount an adaptive immune response and produce a bunch of specific lymphocytes. So let's talk about the life cycle of a lymphocyte. So the life cycle of a lymphocyte, it all begins with production, or their origin in the red bone marrow. So all blood cells are produced in the red bone marrow. So lymphocytes originate with their production in the red bone marrow. If you recall, we said that the primary lymphatic organs were the red bone marrow and the thymus. And what made them primary lymphatic organs is they were involved in the production and maturation of lymphocytes. So T and B cells are both produced in the red bone marrow. B cells are going to mature in the red bone marrow. So what does maturation mean? Maturation means that you learn to recognize a general class of antigen. What was an antigen? Remember back at blood when we talked about self-antigens? Antigens are just proteins that cause an immune response. So antigens could be things that are pathogenic and cause disease, or they could be things that are like allergenic and cause an allergic reaction. So an antigen is just something that causes an immune response. Self-antigens mark us as self, but they cause an immune response in someone else. So just remember that. So in maturation, you're learning to recognize a general class of antigen. So when you're mature, we'll say when you leave and you're done with maturation, you're mature, but you're naive, but immunocompetent. So you're immunocompetent because you can recognize a general class of antigen, but you're naive because you haven't met your specific antigen yet. So for maturation, our B cells mature in the red bone marrow, but our T cells have to go to the thymus. And that's where we'll have those resident dendritic cells that are going to present antigen to our T cells to test them and get them through their maturation process. So what is that? Well, T cells are going to destroy your body's self cells that are infected. So we really need to make sure that T cells know what they're doing. Number one, that they can recognize antigen when it's presented, but number two, that they don't respond to self-antigen. So that's going to be a two-step process, and the steps are called positive and negative selection. I'm going to have Good tell you about positive selection. In positive selection, the question is, can you bind to MHC? Because if you can't bind MHC, you're not going to be able to recognize antigen in the body. I know. So if the answer is no, apoptosis. If the answer is yes, you move on to negative selection. And I'm going to have Chip tell you about negative selection. In negative selection, the question is, do you respond to self-antigen? If the answer is yes, you're going to kill your cells. No good. Apoptosis. If the answer is no, you'll keep CD4 or CD8 and move on to the next step in your life cycle. So at the end of negative selection, only about 1% of T cells are going to leave the thymus, which is pretty crazy. Most of them are destroyed by apoptosis. So at the end of negative selection, the T cells will maintain these proteins that are going to be able to bind to one type of our major histocompatibility complex or the other. They're the CD4 and the CD8 protein. So we'll write that information down now, and then we'll talk more about why that matters in just a minute. So at the end of negative selection, our T cells maintain either CD4 or CD8. CD4, you're going to be a T helper cell. If you maintain CD8, you're going to be a cytotoxic T cell. So how can I remember which is which? Well, if I give this little 4 here a peg leg, it sure looks like an H. So T helper cells keep their CD4 proteins. Cytotoxic T cells keep their CD8 proteins. What are these things? These are proteins on the T cell surface that are going to bind to these proteins on antigen-presenting cell surfaces, or just any cell surface, and interact with these proteins here. So our antigen-presenting cells have to be able to talk to T helper cells. So they're going to have a major histocompatibility complex that can bind with that. Any cell that can get infected needs to be able to be destroyed. So any cell with a nucleus is going to have a protein that can bind with this. What are those proteins? They're called major histocompatibility complexes. So we're going to talk more about this in a minute too. This is just so we can get how these things bind. So we've got MHC1 and MHC2. MHC1 is going to bind with CD8. So all nucleated cells will contain that. MHC2 is going to bind with CD4. Why did I tell you this now? Because 2 times 2 is 4. CD4 binds MHC2. CD4 is what's maintained on our T helper cells. 1 times 8 is 8. CD8 is maintained on our cytotoxic T cells. Okay, so now that I'm mature, I'm immunocompetent, but I haven't met my pathogen yet, so I'm naive. So the next thing I do as a naive but immunocompetent lymphocyte is I go hang out in secondary lymphatic organs and await encounter with my antigen. So hang out and wait. Wait for what? The next step in my life cycle, antigen encounter. When I encounter an antigen, it's going to take this 2-step recognition process, and then I'm going to be activated to form a clone of cells. So what does this mean? Antigen encounter. I am presented antigen. And how does this happen? It happens through these major histocompatibility complexes. So MHC1 is the major histocompatibility complex 1. Major histocompatibility complex. MHC1 is on all nucleated cells. So any cell that can get infected has an MHC1 complex on its surface. MHC2 is only found on antigen-presenting cells. And if we think about who these were just binding to, this is going to bind to our CD8 protein on our cytotoxic T cell. These are going to kill any cell that can get infected. What's that? Any cell with a nucleus. MHC2 is going to bind to the CD4 on my helper T cells. And these are going to be required for both branches of the immune system to be activated. Both cell-mediated immunity or humoral immunity are going to rely on helper T cells. So antigen presentation can happen for either branch, so we'll be able to activate our helper T cells for either branch. So, okay, so how does this happen? How does antigen presentation work? Well, let's just imagine that you're a macrophage and you have encountered some pathogen in the body. Then what you're going to do is stick the antigen up into your MHC1 and MHC2 proteins. And now we can activate our I'm just going to cut that part out. Okay. Okay, so once you have encountered your antigen and it has been processed and displayed in MHC1 or MHC2, you're going to have to undergo this 1-2 kind of co-stimulatory process so that you can be activated. So antigen encounter is going to lead to activation. What is activation? You're going to be activated to form a clone. What's a clone? It's a large group of cells that are specific to the specific antigen. So in this antigen encounter step, it's going to require multi-stage activation of our parent cell to get activated. All of the daughter cells then are not going to require multi-step activation. This huge clone of cells is going to be able to go out and carry out this effector response and rid the body of the pathogen. So we'll talk about the specifics of antigen encounter and activation in just a minute. The last step of the lymphocyte's life cycle is proliferation and differentiation. The clone of cells that we made is going to be produced, and we'll get a whole lot of cells that are going to differentiate into effector cells that carry out some effector response, and memory cells that are going to hang out and await future encounter with that pathogen. So where we really start to get different is in this antigen encounter stage and activation stage, and then your proliferation and differentiation stage. So when you proliferate, you're going to proliferate into effector cells that carry out an effector response. The effector response of T helper cells is to pump out interleukins. We'll talk more about this in a minute. The effector response of a cytotoxic T cell is to induce apoptosis. And then our effector cells in the B cell response are actually plasma cells. And they are going to pump out antibodies. Okay? So when we proliferate, this is this huge clone of cells that are going to be activated already to form the specific pathogen. And we're going to be able to differentiate into effector cells. T helper cells pump out interleukins. Cytotoxic T effector cells induce apoptosis. The effector cells in the B cell response are plasma cells that pump out antibodies. And then we will also make memory cells. These memory cells are what give us immunity. These hang out in secondary structures and await future encounter with the same pathogen. And now, let's say this is cold virus A we're talking about. Then my memory T cells, next time I encounter cold virus A, are going to immediately be activated to form a clone of cells that can fight. I'm not going to require antigen encounter and this two-step activation. I'm just going to immediately be able to fight off the pathogen when it presents into my body. So that's what gives us immunity. So my memory cells wait future, or we could say they await future encounter with the same antigen and mount a faster and bigger immune response. Mount a faster and bigger response. Who knows what type of cells keep CD4? That's right, T helper cells. What type of cells keep CD8? You got it, cytotoxic T cells.